New year, fresh start, time to recreate myself. What will I find when I walk down this path? New friends, new goals, new challenges to be met. I will meet them and I am going to succeed. New year, fresh start, it's time for self-discovery.
Episode 10. A Stand Against Evil.
Wow. I've read history books and secondhand accounts about the Bright War, but I've never really heard an actual story from someone who lived through it.
What about Miss Vottheis?
What about her?
Well, according to her, she also fought in the Bright War.
At first, Issa just gaped at Noah with a flat expression. But then her eyes opened wide. Her mouth fell ajar.
No way. Miss Vottheis? I can't believe it. I mean, I know she's a devil and a great fighter, but she's the sweetest person I've ever met.
Sometimes the people who smile the biggest are the ones who know the greatest pain and sorrow.
I have a question.
Doma was still scratching Samuel behind the right ear. The fox's lips curled upward and his eyes fluttered between delightful unconsciousness and pre-awakening. Doma waved her free hand as if she were in a class. Noah grinned widely. So did Issa.
Yes, what is it?
What is the difference between an archangel and a normal one?
Well, archangels have silver-colored magical rings around their irises, brighter wings, and they have greater magic potency.
Then how come you don't have a ring around your eyes right now?
Noah held up his hand and gestured to the silver ring on his right hand.
Well, because of this. I developed this little artifact to conceal me from anyone sensing or seeing my true nature.
Doma waved her hand again.
Excuse me.
Yes.
That's not what I meant by difference. I'm sorry, I should have been more clear. How do the archangels differ in terms of societal hierarchy than normal angels? Are they like a part of the nobility or some kind of ruling class? And is there anything above archangels?
Noah let out a nervous chuckle, which was trailed by a riotous bout of laughter coming from the fox on Doma's lap.
I like you, kid. You're all right.
Aww.
Doma began scratching the back of Samuel's neck with both hands, and the fox sank into absolute bliss. Samuel's tail flicked wildly against the couch, which only encouraged Doma to maintain her effort.
She's the top of her class and loves learning. She gets it from me.
It's actually pretty impressive. Well, archangels aren't really like nobles, as they are more like the elite and most powerful of the Heavenos forces. To be accepted into the Archangel Legion is a great honor, and only the most skilled and honorable angels are selected. Normally, candidates have to be selected by the Radiant Council, but for me, Arcadian's endorsement was all that was required. The Radiant Council was the governing body for all of Heavenos, by the way.
So there's only a limited number of archangels?
Granted, I can't tell you what it looks like now, but when I was in Heavenos, there were maybe around 10,000 of us.
10,000? That's such a high number. How big is Heavenos anyway?
Well, it is its own dimension, like Helos is. I'd say when I lived there, there were 340 million angels living in the many cities. The archangels lived in the capital, though, in order to protect the Edina and train with the Legion.
What's the Edina?
Yeah, I remember you mentioned that in your story, and I was super curious about it too.
Well, the Edina is the grand cathedral where the Radiant Council existed. For angels, there is no site more holy or hallowed. At least, it was supposed to be holy and hallowed.
A great quiet filled the room, and only Samuel had the nerve to break it.
Clench your butt cheeks, ladies. This is where the story gets dark.
Dark?
Yes. Let me tell you about my last day in Heavenos, the day that evil had tainted the Edina.
The very atmosphere within the Edina was different than normal. Whenever Marzo beheld the grand cathedral, A great sense of awe blossomed within him. It ignited a living flame within the depths of his soul. Today, however, Marzo's insides dripped with a terrible and sticky acid. The intricate marble floors of the cathedral seemed to expand into infinity, and Marzo's body buzzed as if he floated in a void of geometric shapes and lines. The golden columns stretched upward like stone trees, and they held up the mosaic-covered ceilings high above. Images of great and benevolent angel and archangel beings stared down at Marzo and the hundreds of others who had gathered within the Adena for this event. Where were those benevolent beings now? Surely not within the glowing orb that housed the Radiant Council, for no holy being would ever condone this. Marzo stood alongside dozens of other archangels inside the main chamber of the Adena, where the glowing orb rested on a massive white stone altar. The orb itself sat within a golden and silver apparatus that locked the sphere in place. Intense swirling light that reflected all colors of creation danced within the orb, and hues from the many lights stretched across the marble floors. Sometime in the establishment of Heavenos, the greatest artificers had gathered together to make the most powerful, most impressive artifact that would ever be. It was said that the orb contained every single angel's soul who had ever existed, and stored them in a sort of pocket dimension. Arcadian stood before the Radiant Council, a proud smirk creasing his face. A demon bound by silver chains, chains that Marzo himself had constructed, knelt beside the Archangel General. It wasn't just any demon, though. The demon was gargantuan by dimensions, and surely weighed 500 or 600 pounds, all muscle and power to be sure. His skin held an orange-reddish hue, and it contrasted well with his long, jet-black hair. A pair of powerful eyes stared at the floor, unwilling to gaze into the spiral of the Radiant Council. The demon's wings were also shackled and chained, and each of the demon's binds were pulled tight so he couldn't move. Marzo licked his lips, and his stomach imploded in on itself. Even though they were enemies, to see King Yaogodon in such a defeated state sent violent shivers throughout him. As terrible a sight as it was, it paled in comparison to the smaller creature bound just behind the Demon King. A little demon girl, perhaps no more than 5 or 6, sat in a similar locked position as that of her father. She had garnet-colored skin. Streams of tears trailed down the little demon's face, and her long black hair fell to the ground around her. The little demon girl didn't even have wings yet. A small bit of relief appeared on the barest edges of Marzo's consciousness, for he had not been on the covert mission to sneak into Helos and kidnap the little princess. He didn't even know about it, and had he known, well, Marzo was not sure what he would have done. Long wooden pews lined most of the chamber, and they formed rows before the great altar. Marzo sat in the front row, right beside the Archangel Kasina. The remainder of the pews behind Marzo were completely filled. Despite the grimness of what was explained, Kasina smiled wildly, and she beamed hate-filled stares at the little girl and the great king. Her hand rested on Marzo's thigh, and she kept caressing it and squeezing it tenderly. That small gesture between lovers did nothing to alleviate the tension within Marzo's heart. All he was told was that King Yaogodon and his youngest daughter would be presented before the Radiant Council. There were dark whispers, of course, of what might happen, but Marzo rejected such notions. Surely the grim talk was just that, talk. A million voices spoke together in unison, and it chilled Marzo to hear the combined consciousness of angel kind long gone, but never forgotten.
You have done well. With the capture of King Yaogoden, the Bright War will end soon.
Marzo's heart pumped harder as the crowd cheered. King Yagoden remained silent and refused to look up. The demon child whimpered, but no one paid her any mind. Arcadian held up his hand, and at once the cheering died down. Heavy silence pressed down upon them, and everyone waited to hear what the most powerful archangel would say. He smiled at the Radiant Council and then whirled to address the congregation.
It is true that the Bright War will be ending soon, and none more than I will be happy to see an end to the conflict. However, there is one important thing we must do before we let this bitter conflict cease. We must send a message to the vile devils who still wage war against us. A swift and severe message of what is to come.
Once more, the angels and archangels cheered, but Marzo didn't. Instead, he studied the Demon King, who finally peered up at Arcadian from the barest corner of his eye. The acid that appeared inside Marzo earlier bubbled, and his skin crawled.
What kind of message did you have in mind?
Arcadian pointed to the little girl.
We must show the depth of our conviction.
No one cheered, and King Yagoden now looked directly at the Archangel General, his face a mask of unsettling denial. Marzo shared that same mask. Surely he couldn't mean...
Helos is a scarred blight on creation itself, and we must purge it before it can be cleansed. Every one of those twisted, malformed vermin must be exterminated.
Arcadian smiled, and it was the kind of smile Marzo had never seen on his commanding officer. It dripped with a darkness far more horrifying than anything he had ever seen on the battlefield.
Yes. Let this little one be first.
King Yagoden roared loudly, and he struggled against the chains. His fiery passions had returned, and a desperate sense of urgency saturated the air. Despite the king's efforts, the chains would never break. They were a special artifact designed to resist demonic effort. The chains only unclenched when the subject died, or through the use of a special command that only Marzo and Arcadian knew. The little girl stared up at Arcadian as he took a step forward. All of the angels and archangels watched in utter silence, and none dared even breathe. The gravity of the silence became deadly as even the Radiant Council refused to speak or protest. Arcadian stretched out his hand, and a silver light began to extend from his palm. In mere seconds, the blade that Marzo had created for him over 20 years before glimmered in the interior light of the Adina. The little girl screamed and tried to wiggle away, to no avail. Like the chains that bound the Demon King, hers would never break either. Arcadian's smile grew wider and more wicked as he took another step.
No!
The silence of the Adina had been shattered, and Marzo's skin shivered in the wake of the scream. 1,000 ghostly fingers kept rubbing the surface of his soul, for he was the one standing, and the scream passed through his lips. Arcadian glared at him.
What do you mean, no?
Marzo leapt into the air and landed before the little girl. His bones quaked within him, and the desire to vomit on the beautiful floors of the Adina nearly dominated his will. Unfortunately for him, Marzo couldn't stop now. He had already taken the first steps down a destiny he had not intended on pursuing, and yet, what other option did he have? Marzo extended his hands to block the Archangel General. The little girl wailed loudly, King Yagodin howled as he exerted his voice, and both sounds were quite crisp and clear as they echoed throughout the otherwise silent Adina.
We cannot do this. You cannot do this.
Arcadian narrowed his eyes and gripped the sword handle with both hands.
Get out of the way! The denizens of Hellos are abominations who need to be wiped out!
The continued silence of the Radiant Council chilled Marzo's soul.
No, we are beings of light, not evil monsters! To do this, you would have to be far worse than the enemies we face. She's just a little girl.
They are not like us! They are vile!
Arcadian pointed toward the Radiant Council.
They have plagued us for far too long. Heavenos must consume Hellos and expand. Only by killing every last demon and devil can the angels be safe to thrive.
Marzo's soul withered as the Radiant Council finally replied.
Yes. Perhaps Hellos should be wiped out.
No, I won't let you kill her!
Once more, only the sounds of the king and his daughter filled the expanse of the Adina. Arcadian's words eventually came out.
You would dare stand against us! With them!
Marzo looked to the crowd, especially at Kasina.
We are angels and we are the holiest creatures in existence! Aren't we? War is one thing, but what you are proposing is genocide! That goes against everything that we stand for.
You are either with Heavenos or Hellos. There is no in-between.
Make your choice, Archangel Marzo.
No one said anything. No one else stood up, and they all watched him with grim fascination.
Is it truly the will of the Radiant Council to allow this little girl's death?
An uncomfortable silence lingered before the Radiant Council answered.
Yes.
A tear trailed down Marzo's cheek.
Then I have no choice.
Marzo channeled his magical power and activated his most powerful artifact. The belt buckle that sat at the center of his waist started to sparkle. It flashed with silver light, and then 4 glowing orbs burst from it. The orbs swirled around Marzo and the little girl continuously, and Arcadian stepped back a few paces. The Archangel General's eyes narrowed, and he snarled. After several revolutions, the orbs slowed, and then landed on the ground around Marzo and the little girl. They glowed brighter and began to alter in shape, and then they took the forms of 4 angelic creatures. The 4 angelic-like golems were made from the hardest metal, had large wings, were carved in the likeness of the archangels, and were armed with unique weapons: a great sword, an axe, a bow with unlimited arrows, and a sword and shield, respectively.
You summoned us, Father.
Marzo tightened his jaw, and the entirety of the Adina waited in silence to hear what his response would be. Even King Yagodin halted for a moment. The little girl sobbed softly, but she stared at the 4 giant golems with petrified awe.
Protect the little girl from any angel or archangel who comes near her.
Are you referring to the demon girl?
Marzo moved past the golems and stood before Arcadian.
Yes. Be extra wary of Arcadian. He may kill me, but fight until you are destroyed. Thank you for everything you've done for me. Sorry it has to end this way.
We will do what you say, Father, until we are destroyed.
The 4 golems held their weapons at the ready and took defensive stances around the little girl. Marzo summoned his spear Ie and pointed it at Arcadian.
Traitor!
Kasina leapt over the pew and summoned her own weapon, but Arcadian held up his hand.
Leave this wretch to me. Take out his golems, but leave the girl alive. I want to end her personally.
Marzo activated his greaves of speed, his bracers of strength, and his circlet of clarity, and still his nerves rattled. This would be his last battle. Arcadian was on him in an instant, and the Archangel's greatsword curved through the air, as if it were made of wind itself. Marzo spun around, twirled his spear, and jabbed when he could. Though the spear tip came close many times, Arcadian knocked it away at the last moment. What was his endgame? Marzo's mind buzzed, and yet he dismissed such an unhelpful question. He couldn't make a mistake, for even a single one would be the end. A wild madness danced in Arcadian's eyes as he kept swinging, stepping, and thrusting. A dozen archangels had descended upon the little girl, but the last 3 remaining golems kept them at bay. One of them lay carved open and broken on the Adena floor. Kasina's face contorted in rage as she drove her sword against one of the other golems, where a grievous crack had formed. A large chunk of the golem's face splintered off. It died a few moments later.
Your efforts were in vain, traitor. Before you die, I will make you watch as I carve that little girl apart. You cannot beat me.
You're right. I can't.
Marzo hopped back and reached forward with his hand.
Artifacts shatter!
A green orb appeared in Marzo's hand, and it sailed toward Arcadian. At the last moment, Arcadian sidestepped out of the way. The orb sailed an inch away from the edge of the sacred blade that Marzo had made long ago. Nevertheless, Marzo still smiled.
Why are you smiling? You missed.
Marzo grinned wider, although it was the kind of smile that preceded a desperate death.
I wasn't aiming for you.
Arcadian's eyes widened, and he quickly whirled about. King Yagodin stood unbound, and his eyes burned with a black and red fire. He took a deep breath, and then his hands glimmered in the most intense aura of magic. Seconds later, 3 swirling arcane portals opened beside him. Within seconds, demons poured into the Adena. That had never happened before. Not in the entire history of Heavenos itself.
To arms! Protect the Radiant Council!
King Yagodin leapt toward his daughter, and an obsidian-colored great axe had formed in his grip. Its blade burned with an onyx and ruby fire. More and more demons stepped through the portal. No, wait. Not demons. These were archdemons. Kasina clashed swords with a particularly nasty fellow, and Arcadian twirled between 2 archdemons wielding barbed whips. The Radiant Council screamed loudly, which made Marzo wince. He glanced over, and the remains of his golems lay beside the broken bodies of archangels. The little girl clung to her father, who hugged her tightly. Marzo couldn't hear the words, but he recognized the gesture. King Yagodin pointed toward the Radiant Council orb, and more than a dozen archdemons sprinted. What was he supposed to do? Fight? He was already a traitor, but his transgressions had been compounded to an even greater scale. Not only did he oppose his commanding officer, not only did he free a demon king in captivity, but he allowed for the Adena to become invaded. At the moment, no one paid him any attention, but that would soon change, no doubt.
Make me a one-time use magical bead that will take me far from here. Once used, may it shatter and erase my magical trajectory. Take me to where I can be safe.
Moments later, a small white bead rested in Marzo's hands. He held it close, and then activated its magic. Everything became bathed in white, and he caught one final glimpse of Heavenos. Right as the glowing orb containing the Radiant Council shattered.